Campground Slaughter. An exploitation film can be defined as any film that exploits a particular subject matter, whether said matter is lurid or controversial or otherwise. These films would run the gambit from blaxploitation to borderline torture porn, usually with a shoestring budget and underperforming actors. They gained significant popularity in the 1970s, though their exact origins are debatable. These films were notable for their often obscene levels of depravity and violence, to the degree that entire subgenres were defined based on the type of violence. Cannibalism, torture, splatter, and even slasher films could be defined as part of the exploitation film genre. Even more famous films like Night of the Living Dead and Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy could be considered exploitation. Women were the most common subject matter for these films to utilize, and sex was often the easiest way to sell a movie, and many would spice up the genre with their other aspects, such as so-called revenge films. Said subgenre requires little explanation. While many of these films have gained a cult following, many have fallen to the wayside, forgotten beneath their contemporaries. These films practically vanished from the public eye, often finding themselves dumped into bargain bins of dingy video stores. Campground Slaughter was one such film. Produced by Alan Rickwalder in 1975, Campground Slaughter was an eerie slasher film with the premise that a group of promiscuous teens camped near the site of a serial murderer many decades prior. The plot itself was fairly standard and was only notable at the time for ending with the death of the main protagonist named Maria in an exceptionally brutal fashion. What is notable, however, are the rumors and stories surrounding the production. Alan Rickwalder's production company, Rickwalder Films, was based out of Akron, Ohio. Rickwalder was notably cheap and went so far as to purchase a car park, scheduled for demolition, as his primary soundstage. The company had been in existence since the 1940s, where Rickwalder's father received commissions by the United States government to produce war propaganda and anti-drug films, similar in vein to the famous Reefer Madness. And from there, it moved to produce science fiction during the 1950s, then back to anti-drug films throughout the 60s. As would be expected from their track record, Rickwalder Films jumped at the opportunity to cash in on newest cinematic craze. Rickwalder himself was often described as a jovial man, slightly overweight, with large glasses and an unkempt beard. One could be mistaken for thinking him a vagrant. Instead, he was a rather well-off individual with a family, children, and even several other income properties to his name. Of particular note was his obsession with supernatural films. He went on record multiple times stating his desire to make his own, but budgetary restraints kept him from creating his vision. Campfire Slaughter went into pre-production in early March of 1975. The script, penned by Joseph Esther, was rewritten several times at Rickwalder's request. He stated that the film needed to, and I quote, really push what movies could get away with. Scenes with more nudity, sex, and violence were added to the point that several had to be cut to meet the production budget. The actors were underpaid college students, most of which were attending the nearby University of Akron, an ichthyology major who auditioned for the starring role of Maria at the behest of her friends, several of whom had signed on as unpaid extras. The film's production began without incident. Indoor scenes were shot in the car park, with sets built to emulate a high school, old-timey shop, and sets such as those. It is notable that Rickwalder fired his previous director during this time and began taking on nearly all management duties. Workers noted that he seemed distant and utterly focused on his work. Even his family began to notice a change in him, as his once amiable personality transformed to one of aloofness and isolation. He would often spend hours, even days at a time, locked away in his editing room. The first documented incident was a conflict with one of the actors, Jack Manderley, during the filming of a school scene. Rick Walder criticized the man's performance intensely. The two argued back and forth for hours, with the director claiming that Manderley lacked dedication to his work. In the end, Jack left the production and was quickly written out of the script to ensure shooting would continue as planned. It was at this point that staff began to complain of technical problems on set. Electronic devices would frequently malfunction, tools would go missing, and Rick Walder was noted to become even more reclusive. In one instance, a janitor claimed that he caught a glimpse of the director's notes, and that they were scrawled with incoherent rambling and several symbols he described as kinda like an eye, but with a bunch of circles around it. The janitor stated that after this occurred, Rick Walder fired him for an unrelated incident that the janitor claimed never happened. The symbol in question was also found in several locations around the set, usually squirreled away on equipment or behind props. Actors claimed that they would occasionally catch glimpses of the eye-like symbols, and that afterwards would experience terrible migraines. Lethargy and a myriad of other health problems were claimed to follow observation of these symbols, but these reports cannot be adequately confirmed. Filming of the outdoor scenes began in late March 1975. By this point, much of the original crew had left the production, citing a menagerie of stresses. The most significant of these stresses was Rick Walder himself. He was often described as sullen, temperamental, and looking like he hadn't slept in weeks. His habits pursued him through the filming of these scenes, where he would often put the actors through deliberately stressful scenarios. He claimed these were to get the right performances. In one instance, when the scene called for Maria to nearly fall into a ravine, Rick Walder forced Miss Connolly to actually dangle over a ravine for 5 minutes to get the right emotional tone. In another incident, staff claimed that someone broke into the set during the night, leaving a black tar-like substance on most of the equipment. Rick Walder was blamed, but he claimed no knowledge of the incident. Staff even claimed to see, during filming, unidentified movement in the surrounding brush. When someone would investigate, there would be, of course, nothing there. Records of events during this time are somewhat scarce, however, and most evidence can only be gleaned through eyewitness testimony. One such witness was Joseph Esther himself, who had stayed throughout the entire production. He stated that while Rick Walder would lock himself away in the editing room, he'd periodically forget to secure it when he returned home. It was on one such occasion that Esther snuck inside to see what his coworker was actually doing. He claimed that the room was in shambles, with papers and film reels scattered about in a frenzy of disorganization. The equipment was damaged beyond repair, save for a single film projector pointed at the blank white wall. On the desk were at least a dozen papers, each scrawled with unintelligible nonsense. Esther noted that almost every one had an eye, with several circles drawn on them. He flicked the projector on, in spite of his own trepidation, and watched Rick Walder's work. The movie played just as they filmed it, but he said that an overwhelming sense of despair filled him as it went on. Esther claimed that as he watched, he became aware of something moving in the background of the sets. A dark, feminine form that would appear for seconds at a time, and every appearance brought with it a dread that he found difficulty describing. Occasionally, he stated that he saw flickers of the symbol, as though Rick Walder had cut them into the film deliberately. As the victims were killed off, however, Esther said that the appearance of the killer was different from the actor that they had hired. The actor they hired was tall and stocky, with a fairly genetic outfit of a trench coat and mask. They decided never to explicitly show the killer until the final scene, but it was supposed to be one of Maria's friends, her boyfriend. And yet, every glimpse of the killer in the film showed a sleek, feminine body. He couldn't tell if she was even wearing clothes. It had long black hair that obscured any facial features, but he said that he saw glimpses of its face occasionally. He refused to describe it further. As the film built up to the final scene where the killer was meant to sneak up on Maria, Esther said that something brushed against him just as the actress screamed. He turned to find that the room was absolutely empty. He was still totally alone. After that, Esther left the production and moved to Seattle, claiming he had found other work. Similar incidents continued until the final scene was to be filmed. This was the most effects-heavy scene, so Rick Walder saw fit to film it last to save time and money. The killer was to finally confront Maria, and a conflict was to ensue, ending when Maria is overwhelmed and stabbed to death. Conley thought the scene went too far, but when Rick Walder threatened to kick her off the project, she decided to go along with it. The conflict went as expected. The killer lunged at Maria, who fought and kicked at him. This went on for several minutes until Maria was totally wounded. The killer stood and began to remove his mask, but just as he did, one of the set's lighting fixtures collapsed onto the two actors. The actor portraying the killer was terribly injured and rushed to a nearby hospital, where he later died. Connolly suffered similar injuries, including multiple crushed bones and electrical burns. The attending physician was initially unwilling to speak, but eventually stated that the electrical burns, quote, looked like human handprints. Miss Connolly survived her initial injuries, but later died of complications during surgery. The production was wrapped and Rick Walder planned to recut the film to not include the final scene. Many of the staff quit the company, and the actors returned to their daily lives. Rick Walder, however, did not. His wife claimed he became obsessed with the film, that she would find him in their basement, still trying to cut together a coherent story. She would later file for divorce and move to Arizona, leaving Rick Walder alone to his work. The film did eventually release, but only to one obscure theater in town. No reviews were ever published off the event, and no records are available to determine the exact audience response. Only one individual came forward, a Miss Justine Caldwell, to provide an account of the screening. She claimed that Rick Walder was present at the screening and that he looked even more haggard than usual. His eyes were sunken, his hair was disheveled, his clothes soaked with sweat and crumbs. She said that she thought she saw scratches on his arms, but she wasn't completely sure. No one from the film's crew, cast, or otherwise attended the screening. Camp Slaughterhouse played in exactly the manner the script described. The teens discussed the camping trip at school, met with their families, etc. However, she said that people began to get uncomfortable during the screening, shifting in their seats and looking around. She said that something could be seen moving behind the sets, usually in windows or in dark corners. There'd be brief flashes of the symbol occasionally, but Miss Caldwell claimed they occurred so quickly they didn't register until much later. The unknown individual's appearance increased as the film continued, comparing Miss Caldwell and Mr. Esther's statements. It seemed that the cuts of the movie were quite similar. Even still, the manner in which the victims died began to deviate over the course of the feature. The script called for one teen to be hacked to death with an axe, yet the film showed them being flayed alive. Another was supposed to be strangled. She was decapitated and eaten by an unseen entity. Miss Caldwell stated that people began to cry out in the front rows, saying that someone had touched them. A few even screamed. And just as Miss Caldwell claimed she was about to leave, the final scene began. Maria stumbled through the woods, panting and screaming as the killer stalked her. The confrontation concluded when the killer caught up to Maria in a small clearing. This clearing was never used on set, nor is it mentioned in any version of the script. It was stated that Maria then looked straight at the camera, crying and begging for someone to help her. Miss Caldwell claimed that she didn't just look at the camera, though. She said that Maria looked directly at the audience. The killer stepped forward and with a long serrated knife, gutted Maria on screen in intense detail. The projector began to malfunction, causing the picture to wobble back and forth on the screen as the killer stood and stared at the camera intensely. Miss Caldwell said that the killer resembled a woman, about average height and build. She was totally naked, with a head of unkempt black hair. She said her body looked decayed, with black slime emerging from cracked porcelain-like skin. The woman stood there, staring at the camera for nearly 30 seconds, before the film finally ended. The movie was a flop in every sense of the word. Most of the attendees requested refunds, and the theater refused to ever show any of Rick Walder's work again. The man disappeared into his humble 2-story home and was not heard from again for nearly 8 weeks. Eventually, neighbors complained of a terrible smell coming from the house, and police were asked to investigate. After obtaining the proper warrants, the officers forced their way inside to find the house in shambles. Black fluid was spread across the walls and floors, dripping from the ceiling in clumps. The officers found it flowing from the faucets, the kitchen sink, even the air conditioning with no obvious source. Scratching noises from the basement drew them further into the home, where they found Rick Walder collapsed on the floor. The basement had been converted into a small editing room, with mountains of film and paperwork scattered among the desks and projectors. And the words, "Her," had been written across the walls and floors. Incoherent notes from Rick Walder about his muse were found, along with thousands of drawings of decayed women. The man's body was in a state of black putrefaction, with markings indicated he committed suicide by slitting his wrists. Strangely, though, an autopsy later determined that his remains should have still been relatively intact, as he appeared to have only died a few days prior. A nearly pristine note was found clutched in his hand. The coroner stated that it said, "I wanted inspiration. I wanted to make real horror. I never should have let her in. I never should have let her take them. I found a new scene in the movie yesterday. I was in it." Campground Slaughter has since become a lost film. Only one copy remains in existence. It has since disappeared from police archives, though there have been reports of it appearing in film collections across the country. Said reports are obviously untrue, as no version of the film exists other than the Rick Walder cut. Film buffs, at least those who know of its existence, have offered upwards of 6 figures for a genuine copy. However, in spite of all the hearsay and rumors, one thing can be conclusively stated about these events. Every actor, each one that died on screen, would pass away in the years after the films first screened. Jessica Pickman, for instance, played the main character's best friend. 3 months after the film finished, she was struck by a drunk driver on her way home from class. As the EMTs attempted to revive her, it was claimed that she stared at the other side of the road and asked, "What is that woman doing here?" There was no woman present at the time.